Prague in the late 1500s was complicated. On the surface, a jewel of Central Europe, golden spires, bustling markets, music drifting across the Vltava. But beneath the charm, narrow streets clogged with mud, a fair chance of plague, and, if you were unlucky, a tax collector at your door. And unlike the plague, the tax collector always came back. The Jewish quarter was a world within a world. Children played in streets barely wide enough for 2 donkeys to pass. Women bartered for bread while keeping one wary eye on the gate, because at any moment, rumour or riot could come crashing through. Still, there was laughter, weddings, the smell of fresh loaves from clay ovens, resilience woven into daily life. It was survival, with a touch of joy. And if joy sometimes required ignoring the smell of your neighbour's goat, well, so be it. Inside the ghetto walls, life was noisy, messy, human. Vendors shouted in 3 languages at once, competing with clanging church bells and the occasional drunken fiddler who thought every street corner was his stage. Homes leaned over the cobblestones so close that if you leaned out your window too far, you might end up eating your neighbour's soup by accident. But there was also tension, thick as smoke. Everyone knew safety here was a fragile illusion. A child's cough could turn into whispers of plague, a merchant's misstep into accusations of fraud. And if a Christian baker burned his bread, well, somehow the rumour could twist itself into a Jewish conspiracy by nightfall. It didn't take much, just fear, wine, and a crowd looking for someone to blame. And so the Jewish quarter lived between light and shadow, a place of joy and learning, but always under threat. The people lit candles on Sabbath and sang ancient songs, knowing full well that one day those same flames might be needed to keep watch at the gate. It was in this world of balance, between resilience and fear, laughter and suspicion, that the legend of the Golem would take root. Every community has its wise man, the one people turn to when things get confusing, frightening, or just plain absurd. In Prague's Jewish quarter, that man was Rabbi Judah Lo ben Bezalel, though most simply called him Rabbi Lo. Titles were nice, but in practice, when your neighbour thinks his cow is possessed or your son refuses to study, you don't shout for the Maharal of Prague. You shout for the rabbi. Rabbi Lo was no ordinary teacher. He was a scholar whose mind wandered comfortably from scripture to philosophy, from Hebrew prayers to the newest whispers of science drifting up from Italy. His study was a fortress of scrolls and candlelight, with ink stains marking more battles fought on parchment than any soldier ever saw in the field. People said he hardly slept, preferring to spend nights bent over books thick enough to knock a man unconscious. He studied Torah, of course, but also ethics, mathematics, astronomy. And then there were the rumours. The idea that his studies reached into Kabbalah, the hidden knowledge of letters, numbers, and mysteries best left to angels. Did he really read the stars like other men read the market prices? Did he really know the secret names of God, syllables too dangerous for ordinary tongues? Hard to say. In Prague, a story repeated twice was already halfway to fact, and by the 3rd retelling, someone's cousin swore they'd seen it with their own eyes. But, true or not, the effect was the same. Rabbi Lo wasn't just a teacher. He was a figure of awe, a man you approached with reverence. And in dangerous times, he was something even rarer. A man people believed could bend the invisible forces of the world itself. And when fear began to press hard against the gates of the ghetto, belief was just as powerful as fact. One night, Rabbi Lo left his study and walked toward the riverbank. With him were 2 of his most trusted students, men who had no doubt agreed eagerly before realizing that assisting in the creation of life meant digging in the mud at midnight. The Vltava was quiet, its dark waters reflecting a thin slice of moon. Lanterns swung at their sides, throwing golden circles into the night as the men stooped to claw clay from the earth. Slowly, painfully, they molded it into the shape of a man. Though man feels too small a word. This was something larger, heavier, with shoulders like carved stone and arms thick as tree trunks. Piece by piece, the form grew. The students heaved lumps of clay until their backs ached, sweat mixing with the damp river air. Rabbi Lowe oversaw each detail with the precision of a craftsman and the gravity of a priest. When at last the figure lay finished, it stretched out on the ground, silent and immense. Then came the moment that legends cling to. Rabbi Lowe bent close, whispering sacred words, words said to carry the power of creation itself. His hand hovered near the brow of the clay figure, fingers trembling as though he stood on the line between daring and blasphemy. A candle flame flickered. The students held their breath. For a moment, nothing moved. The figure was only mud, heavy and cold. But then its chest shifted, a slow rise, a heavy fall. Dust stirred around its body. Its eyes cracked open, glowing faintly, like embers in a dying fire. The students stumbled back in terror. They had come to help their master shape clay. Instead, they watched it rise. And thus, with mud, sweat, and a touch of divine audacity, the Golem of Prague opened its eyes. At first, the creature moved like wet stone, trying to remember how to be human. Each step was slow, deliberate, the weight of its body pressing into the cobblestones. Dust fell from its shoulders with every motion. Its blank clay face gave nothing away. No anger, no joy, not even confusion. Just emptiness, punctuated by those faintly glowing eyes. The students gasped. One nearly dropped his lantern, the other muttered a prayer under his breath as though reminding God that this hadn't been his idea. Rabbi Lowe alone stood steady, hands folded, as if watching a plan unfold exactly as intended, though one suspects even he hadn't rehearsed this part in detail. When commanded, the golem obeyed. It carried stones as though they were feathers, lifted water barrels that usually took 4 men, and followed its master's word with the silence of a shadow. Silent, tireless, unstoppable. The perfect servant, assuming your needs fell somewhere between guard duty and demolition work. When the people of the ghetto first saw it, their reactions ranged from awe to absolute terror. Children peered from behind skirts, wide-eyed, while merchants crossed themselves in nervous habit. The sight of a hulking clay giant walking calmly through your neighborhood tends to override the finer points of theology. But it didn't take long for whispers to turn into relief. For the first time in years, families slept without glancing anxiously at the gate. The golem watched the streets, stood sentinel at the doors, and loomed so convincingly that even the drunkest troublemaker sobered instantly at the sight of it. And soon, the story spread. Some swore they saw it patrolling rooftops. Others claimed it could vanish into thin air. One neighbor insisted it had once caught a thief by simply standing still until the man fainted from fear. Legends multiply quickly in a city like Prague, and a giant clay man was too good a story to stay quiet. But to the people inside the ghetto, the truth was simpler. The golem was their protector. A mute, expressionless, somewhat unsettling protector, but protection nonetheless. For a while, the golem was everything Rabbi Lowe had hoped for. It guarded the ghetto gates, carried heavy loads, and scared off troublemakers without uttering a single word. No drunken brawl, no midnight raid, no hostile rumor made it past that blank stare and those smoldering eyes. But protection without judgment is a dangerous kind of safety. The golem followed commands with perfect loyalty, and terrifying efficiency. If you asked it to stop an intruder, it stopped him. Permanently, if necessary. If you ordered it to move a cart, it moved the cart, and sometimes the wall behind it. Subtlety was not included in its skill set. Soon, stories of its strength turned darker. People spoke of bones breaking, walls cracking, men hurled through the air as though they weighed nothing. Each tale grew taller with the telling, of course. Prague was never short on gossip. But even stripped of exaggeration, one truth was clear. The golem was not a man. It could defend, but it could not hesitate. It could act, but it could not choose. Inside the ghetto, families still felt safer, though many crossed the street rather than walk too close to their giant neighbor. Children no longer giggled in its shadow. They ducked behind doorways instead. A protector, yes. A comforting presence? Not exactly. Outside the ghetto, the whispers turned into fear. Witchcraft, people muttered. Dark powers, unnatural things. What kind of man built a creature from clay? And worse, what kind of city let him keep it? Even Rabbi Lu himself, it is said, began to feel uneasy. He had asked for a shield. What he got was a weapon. And weapons once made are not so easily put away. The story says that Rabbi Lu watched his creation more closely with each passing day. The golem obeyed, yes, but too completely. It never paused, never questioned, never showed even the faintest flicker of mercy. A servant without a soul is not a servant at all. It is a blade. Sharp, useful, and always dangerous to hold for too long. And so, one Sabbath evening, Rabbi Lo brought the golem into the synagogue. The candles burned low, their glow stretching shadows up the walls. The giant stood before the Torah ark, still and silent, as if awaiting a command. His students lingered at the edges, their fear barely hidden. Rabbi Lo stepped forward. He reached for the creature's brow, the place where life had been written into clay. His hand moved slowly, almost tenderly, as though erasing not just a letter, but a part of himself. The golem's eyes dimmed. Its chest, which had risen with the rhythm of false breath, fell still. A shudder passed through its body, and then the weight of earth reclaimed it. The giant slumped forward, collapsing onto the stone floor with a sound that seemed far too final. The students gasped. Rabbi Lo stood silent, staring down at what remained. Not a guardian, not a monster, not even a servant. Only clay. They carried it to the attic of the old new synagogue, where light barely touched the beams and dust gathers like memory. There it was laid to rest, silent once more. And perhaps, as the story whispers, it still lies there. The Golem of Prague never really left. Sure, the clay collapsed, the attic gathered dust, and centuries rolled on. But the story, that stayed. It moved through the city like gossip at a market stall, faster than fact, harder to kill, and much more entertaining. For some, the tale is a sermon. Don't meddle in creation. Don't overstep your bounds. For others, it's comfort. When danger closed in, the community dreamed up a protector. And really, who wouldn't sleep a little easier knowing your night watchman doesn't need wages, rest, or even shoes? Over the years, plenty of travelers have crept into the attic of the old new synagogue, hoping to see a shadow in the dust. They come out with nothing but cobwebs, and usually a newfound respect for how dark attics can be when you're alone. Yet, the golem lives on, not in clay, but in the imagination, retold in sermons, painted in books, staged in plays. Prague has never been short on legends, but few have the staying power of a silent giant built from mud. It's hard to compete with that kind of marketing. And so the tale remains. Part warning, part comfort, part entertainment. Was the golem real? Was it only a story? In Prague, those questions hardly matter. What matters is that 4 centuries later, people are still talking about it. And for a creature made of clay, that's not a bad legacy. In the southern bend of Bohemia, where the Vltava River turns as if reconsidering its direction, stands the town of Český Krumlov. It is a place that wakes slowly, as if each morning it must first remember which century it's in. The castle rises above it like a thought that refuses to go away. Tier upon tier of pale stone, it leans over the rooftops, watching its reflection in the river with mild vanity. The Rosenbergs built it to last, though not necessarily to make anyone comfortable. When mist drifts up from the valley, the towers appear to float, a trick the townsfolk have long stopped noticing, though visitors still swear the place looks half-dreamed. From the square below comes the scent of bread and iron, the mingled sounds of church bells and gossip. Life here moves at the pace of the cobblestones, uneven but dependable. Inside the castle lived Perchta of Rosenberg, daughter of the noble house. She grew among courtyards that echoed too much and portraits that judged too quietly. Tutors praised her diligence, priests her humility. It was a comforting arrangement. Everyone complimented her virtues, and no one asked her opinions. The castle itself listened to her steps. Old walls have a way of collecting stories. They prefer the soft ones, the kind spoken to no one. Sometimes when the wind pushed through the corridors, the tapestries would stir as if answering. At dusk, the river darkened to ink, and a single candle glowed in the western tower, Perchta's light. Servants said she stayed awake reading prayers, though no one could recall her looking particularly forgiven. The town below, unaware of its future ghost, settled into the quiet rhythm of another evening. Smoke rose, dogs barked, bells marked the hour. And high above the river, Český Krumlov Castle exhaled, a long, weary sigh of stone. It had felt this before, the stillness that arrives just before a story begins. When Perchta of Rosenberg turned 20, the castle bells rang for 3 days. The townsfolk assumed it was a celebration. It was, in fact, a negotiation. In noble families, love was considered a charming distraction, provided it happened after the contracts were signed. So it was decided, without her consultation, that Perchta would marry Jan of Liechtenstein. The match looked perfect on parchment. Parchment, however, is famously bad at recording tone. Jan was a man of titles, land, and an unwavering devotion to his own reflection. He spoke little, perhaps because listening to others required patience. Soldiers admired his discipline. Servants admired his temper from a safe distance. The wedding took place in midwinter. Snow covered the roofs of Český Krumlov. Bells echoed through the valley, and the Vltava lay still under ice, pretending not to hear the vows. In the great hall, candles burned with the determination of people who knew this would take a while. Perchta stood beside her new husband, pale and composed. She had practiced the expression of serenity, the kind of calm that only truly desperate people achieve. The priest spoke of unity, obedience, and eternal love. None of these were present, but the words sounded nice. And that was enough. After the ceremony, Jan returned to his estates in Moravia almost immediately. Perchta followed, as wives were expected to, and the castle of Český Krumlov watched her carriage disappear into the snow. It was not the first time it had seen a farewell that felt suspiciously permanent. Her letters home soon became quieter. They began with polite formality and ended with phrases that looked like sighs written in ink. "I am well," she wrote. and my husband is often occupied, which, translated from noble correspondence, meant, I am alone, and he prefers his armor to company. Days in Moravia passed like cold breath on glass. There, then gone. Jan held court, inspected his soldiers, and spoke to Perkta mainly when logistics demanded it. She filled her time with prayer, embroidery, and the kind of silence that grows its own echo. Sometimes, in that vast and distant household, she would pause while lighting a candle, certain she heard the Vltava again, faint and far away. The sound of home, though the word no longer applied. And so began the long winter of her marriage, a union of duty and absence, of iron and silence. Even the servants whispered less, as if afraid the air might carry words to the wrong ears. It is said that even the saints in her chapel grew uncomfortable watching. Years passed in Moravia, quietly, as if the world had misplaced her name. Perkta of Rosenberg, once the pride of Český Krumlov, became a pale figure in her husband's northern estate, where the seasons repeated like polite apologies. Jan of Liechtenstein aged without softening. He ran his household with the precision of a tax ledger and the warmth of one too. The servants referred to him only as the Lord, which saved them from the trouble of choosing adjectives. For Perkta, life settled into measured hours. Prayer before dawn, embroidery before dusk, endurance in between. Letters to her family grew rarer, replies rarer still. Distance, both geographic and emotional, is remarkably good at disguising neglect. In the winters, she would stand by the frost-clouded window watching snow swallow the courtyard. Sometimes she would whisper a single word, her own name, just to hear something kind in the air. When her husband fell ill, no one celebrated. It was the sort of illness that announces itself not with drama but with scheduling inconvenience. Perkta tended to him dutifully, though not lovingly. Compassion, in her case, was an act of will. He died one grey morning, surrounded by furniture that had outlasted affection. The priests arrived, muttered their Latin, and departed before the wine cooled. Perkta sat by the window through the entire ceremony, eyes fixed on the line of the horizon. They say she did not curse him. That of all the choices available to the newly widowed, she chose forgiveness, or something that resembled it from a distance. Some claimed it was holiness. Others said it was exhaustion wearing a disguise. After the burial, when the candles were snuffed and the servants dared to exhale again, she took a single letter addressed to her father and placed it into the fire. The parchment curled slowly, the ink bleeding into flame like a confession being rewritten. In the months that followed, she spoke little. Visitors described her voice as distant, her kindness as effortless, and her eyes as belonging to someone who had finished the business of hope. When news of her death finally reached Český Krumlov, the castle's bells rang again, softer this time, as if embarrassed to interrupt. And though her body was laid to rest, the house she had left behind, the one filled with silence, half-finished prayers and candle smoke, was not empty. Places remember gentle people most of all. The first to see her was a servant boy, half asleep and entirely certain he had imagined it. He was carrying a basket of linens through the upper corridor of Český Krumlov Castle when the air changed, that strange stillness that enters a room before memory does. She was there only a moment, pale, calm, her gown flowing as if caught between worlds. The boy dropped the basket, made a sound he would later describe as brave, and fled. By morning, the story had spread through the castle like spilled wine. Quietly at first, then eagerly. The maids crossed themselves. The steward checked for drafts. The priest muttered that faith did not cover this sort of visitation. But the appearances continued. Always in the same corridor, near the western tower where Perkta once lived. Sometimes she smiled faintly, as though passing through a pleasant memory. Sometimes she wept. Those who saw her said the scent of lilies followed, soft, clean, and sorrowful. Others claimed that her steps made no sound, though her presence rustled the air like turning pages. Over the years, the castle learned her moods. A smiling white lady foretold peace or a birth. A weeping one, loss or misfortune. There was a practical advantage to this system. It kept everyone on their best behavior. Visitors came to the castle hoping for a glimpse, or at least a rumor. The Rosenbergs were discreet about it. No noble house wants to be known for hauntings, at least not officially. But servants, as history confirms, have better marketing instincts than lords. One evening, a guest from Vienna, a confident man with the scientific air of those who have not yet met a ghost, declared the story nonsense. He spent the night in the West Corridor to prove it. By morning, he was a devout believer in both spirits and discretion. He also developed a lifelong dislike of lilies. Perkta's apparition never harmed anyone. She merely appeared, looked upon the living with quiet curiosity, and disappeared again, like someone remembering a name she used to answer to. And in time, Český Krumlov castle grew used to her. The staff no longer fled. They greeted her with nods, as one might an older relative who insists on staying. The living and the departed had reached, at last, a polite understanding. Generations passed, but the White Lady remained. Dynasties shifted, languages softened, candles turned to lamps, yet the sound of soft silk in an empty corridor kept returning, like a thought the castle refused to forget. The Rosenbergs learned to live with her the way one lives with the weather, unavoidable, occasionally inconvenient, and entirely beyond negotiation. When a child was born and the nurse swore she saw the White Lady smiling by the window, the family took it as a blessing. When she appeared with tears upon her face, letters were written, wills reviewed, and the household grew unreasonably polite. Records note her presence before weddings, deaths, and political misfortunes. Once, before a disastrous treaty, a clerk reported that she had been seen in the council chamber staring thoughtfully at a map. The treaty went forward anyway, proof that even ghosts cannot prevent human optimism. She became less an apparition and more a tradition. The stewards kept her corridor spotless, the maids left lilies by the window, and every new generation pretended not to look over their shoulders at dusk. There were skeptics, of course. Every family has one relative convinced that centuries of shared experience are simply a matter of poor ventilation. These men rarely lasted long at Český Krumlov, not because of the ghost, but because few people enjoy dinner conversation with a person who insists on debunking the afterlife between courses. Still, the White Lady's appearances seemed to follow a rhythm known only to her. Years might pass in silence. Then, one evening she would glide through the great hall, her pale form reflected in the armor of her ancestors. Those who met her gaze described an emotion difficult to name. Not fear, not sorrow, but recognition. As if she were reminding them that every family, however noble, eventually joins its own history. By the time the last Rosenberg heir was born, even the priests had stopped denying her existence. They simply adjusted their sermons, slightly longer on forgiveness, noticeably shorter on pride. And when that final generation left the castle, one by one, Český Krumlov remained still for a while, the way a room does after everyone has said goodbye. But in the west corridor, near the window that once caught the light of her candle, a faint scent of lilies lingered, as if the past itself had chosen not to move on. The Rosenbergs vanished, as families eventually do. first from portraits, then from memory, and finally from conversation. The castle changed hands the way old stories change storytellers, each new owner adding a detail, forgetting another. Barons, emperors, soldiers, and tourists. All took their turns beneath the painted ceilings of Český Krumlov castle. The furniture changed. The language of servants changed. Even the smell of the kitchens changed. But the White Lady did not. She appeared as she always had, pale, silent, unconcerned with politics. Empires rose outside her windows and fell just as noisily. Kings were crowned, revolutions declared, borders redrawn. Yet the faint sound of silk in a corridor remained one of the few constants in Central Europe. During the 30 Years' War, a mercenary captain reported seeing her on the ramparts the night before his defeat. He described her as calm, almost considerate. Centuries later, a caretaker swore he met her in the library during an electrical storm. She seemed, he said, slightly confused by the lamps. Time reshaped the castle, sanding away its sharp edges. The moat dried, the chapel lost its Latin, and the walls grew heavy with the dust of tourists' footsteps. Yet, when the halls emptied at dusk, something of the old rhythm returned. The breath between heartbeats, the hush of stone listening again. Scholars wrote papers, skeptics visited with instruments, and photographers tried to trap her in light. She remained politely uncooperative. To some, she was proof of the supernatural. To others, a symptom of history refusing to stay quiet. To the castle, she was simply family. And though her appearances grew rarer, there were still nights when the guards would pause in their rounds, claiming to hear footsteps where no one should be, slow, measured, almost curious. Sometimes they followed the sound to the west corridor, and there, by the candle's edge, the air itself seemed to shimmer. The scent of lilies would rise just faintly, as if the White Lady had passed by, not haunting the living but checking on the furniture. Night falls early over Český Krumlov. By the time the last tourists cross the bridge and the lights of the cafes dissolve into the river, the castle returns to itself. Its towers sigh, its corridors settle, and the air grows heavier, not sad exactly, but thoughtful. They say the White Lady still walks, though rarely, sometimes near the chapel, sometimes along the balcony that overlooks the Vltava. She never speaks, but those who have felt her presence insist she carries neither anger nor regret. Only patience. The kind learned by those who have watched centuries drift by and found them all remarkably similar. Caretakers tell quiet stories, of finding fresh lily petals on the cold floor, of doors closing softly when no wind blows. One night, a security guard swore he saw her standing at the highest window. When he blinked, she was gone. When he looked again, his own reflection was staring back, pale, astonished, and very temporary. Perhaps that is her message. Not vengeance, not warning, but remembrance, a reminder that all things, even stone, are passing guests. The castle has seen it all, feasts, famines, coronations, and the slow triumph of dust. And yet it endures because memory is stubborn and beauty even more so. Sometimes, on winter nights, when fog curls along the river and the bells ring from somewhere too far away to name, people walking through the square glance up and see a faint glow in the western tower. A light no one lit and no one dares to extinguish. It flickers softly, like a sigh caught between centuries. And for a moment, the town holds its breath, as if listening for footsteps or for forgiveness. History is generous with its noise. It remembers battles, crowns, and the people who shouted loud enough to be written down. But the quiet ones, the patient, the kind, the unavenged, they survive differently. They stay as scent, as sound, as echo. The White Lady of Český Krumlov is one of those gentle survivors. She asks for nothing, changes nothing, yet somehow reminds everyone who hears her story that the past never fully leaves. It simply chooses softer rooms. Maybe she returns not to haunt, but to check if we've learned anything worth keeping. That's the generous interpretation. And around here, we prefer generous interpretations. So, if one night you find yourself walking along the Vltava and the air feels colder for no reason at all, don't hurry. Pause. You might just be sharing the path with someone who never quite finished saying goodbye. And as the river folds the town into its reflection once more, the castle above it watches, patient, luminous, and still listening. Prague has streets that remember more than they show. Some of them wind up toward the castle, some sink toward the river, and some, the interesting ones, simply sit and wait for stories to return to them. On the edge of Charles Square, where trams now rattle and people hurry as if time were a recent invention, stands a house that has never been in a hurry at all. People call it the Faust House. Not because anyone proved old Dr. Faustus lived there, but because the house behaved in a way that made the legend perfectly believable. It is an odd building, even by Prague standards. Its facade watches the square with a kind of patient curiosity, as if it has seen emperors, monks, students, soldiers, and tourists pass by and decided to let them. The walls are thick, the windows a little too thoughtful, and the cellars, according to everyone who ever had to clean them, are deeper than needed for ordinary human life. Prague, of course, approved. This is a city that likes its mysteries visible and its explanations optional. In earlier centuries, when the square was quieter and the nights longer, people said that light sometimes glowed behind the upper windows at hours when respectable households slept. Not the warm, flickering light of candles, but a strange, steady brightness, the kind that suggested someone was arguing with creation itself. Neighbors whispered that scholars had stayed there. Not the gentle, book-dusting kind, but the restless sort who believed the world ought to tell them more than it was currently telling. Alchemists, physicians, astrologers, all those people who kept glass, fire, and Latin in the same room. Prague was full of them for a time. The house merely offered better acoustics. Even from the street you could feel it. The place had layers. A Baroque front on medieval bones, a Christian cross above a roof that had almost certainly listened to things the church would not have approved of. The kind of house that collected centuries the way other people collect porcelain. During the day, it was harmless. Sunlight on plaster, footsteps in the courtyard, a servant carrying water. But at dusk, when the square emptied and the city slipped back into its older self, the Faust house seemed to lean slightly inward, as if remembering conversations spoken in low voices. People liked to say it was cursed. People liked to say that about any house where interesting things happened after midnight. The truth was simpler, and therefore more unsettling. It was a place where very clever people had tried to learn too much, too fast. And Prague, being a courteous city, had decided to remember it for them. So the house remained, still, pale, listening, on the corner of the square, waiting, as old buildings do, for someone else to ask the same dangerous questions. Long before it was called the Faust House, it belonged to a man whose name history misplaced, but whose habits it remembered. He was a scholar of the old Prague kind, the sort who could quote scripture, scold Aristotle, and accidentally set his own sleeve on fire in the same afternoon. He called himself an alchemist, though that word in the 17th century covered everything from chemistry to wishful thinking. His neighbors called him the doctor, which in Prague meant someone who stayed up too late and worried the natural order of things. The house, it seemed, suited him. The lower rooms were filled with jars, bones, and manuscripts, the upper rooms with drafts and unanswered prayers. By day, he visited the university, where he lectured about balance and reason. By night, he argued with metals about their moral potential. He was obsessed with transmutation, the art of persuading dull matter to become something nobler. Lead into gold, ignorance into wisdom, death into a kind of reconsideration. His experiments were half science, half confession, and neither went particularly well. When the fire beneath his crucible burned too high, strange colours lit the ceiling. The servant said the glow could be seen from across the square, and that once, briefly, the shadow of the cross on the roof turned blue. Prague tolerated such behaviour. It had seen emperors keep astrologers as advisors and monks as spies. One more philosopher talking to Mercury was merely local colour. Still, the butcher across the street developed a habit of closing early. The doctor kept a journal, written in ink so fine it looked like the veins of a leaf. He filled it with symbols, circles, and comments that began logically and ended in poetry. All things contain their opposite, he wrote. If one could find the exact centre between heaven and earth, one might finally rest. Rest was not his strength. Witnesses, and Prague always provides witnesses, recalled hearing him pacing until dawn, reciting phrases in Latin that sounded too affectionate for any known theology. His few visitors found him courteous, distracted, and increasingly luminous around the eyes. He spoke often of unlocking the secret sympathy between light and matter. They assumed it was a metaphor. What he truly wanted, perhaps, was not gold or glory, but conversation with creation itself. The trouble was that creation, when spoken to directly, sometimes answers. And so the light in the upper windows grew brighter, the air heavier, the nights longer. The neighbours learned to sleep through it, as people always do when they suspect curiosity might be contagious. In the morning, smoke rose from the chimneys of the Faust house, grey and innocent, as if it had spent the night warming bread instead of questioning the nature of reality. Prague is generous with its ghosts, but selective with its witnesses. It allows just enough strangeness to be seen to keep everyone uncertain, and therefore interested. So when the neighbours around Charles Square began whispering about the Faust house, it was not the experiments that concerned them. It was the company. They said the doctor was no longer alone. At first, it was the sound of voices, quiet, learned, and entirely out of place at 3 in the morning. The language was not Czech, nor Latin, nor anything comfortably between. Sometimes it seemed to come from the cellars, sometimes from the air itself. One night, a merchant returning late saw the front door ajar. He glanced inside and swore he saw men in long robes bent over a table, the room glowing blue like stormlight underwater. He left before being noticed, and by morning the door was closed, the lock unbroken. Soon there were other reports, footprints that began nowhere and ended at the study wall, a scent of sulphur mixed with lavender, and, most unsettling of all, the faint hum of something that sounded almost like laughter, polite and patient. The doctor, meanwhile, appeared in daylight with the calm of someone who had finally found an audience that understood him. His eyes seemed brighter, his smile more certain. He began to avoid the market altogether, preferring deliveries left at the gate. When he did speak to passers-by, he used phrases that made them uneasy. Some conversations are best held in private. The servant stayed as long as curiosity outweighed fear. One swore she saw a shadow on the wall moving independently of its owner. Another refused to to go near the cellar after hearing a sound like glass being breathed upon. Within a month, the house was quiet again, save for the doctor and whoever else was no longer leaving through the front door. The priest from the nearby church attempted a visit, carrying the full authority of faith and half a bottle of courage. He returned pale, mumbling something about the air feeling incorrect. Still, the square remained calm. Prague has always known how to coexist with heresies. It files them away between superstition and municipal charm. From across the street, the butcher's wife once saw light pouring through the shutters, green, then gold, then colourless, and remarked that the doctor must finally have found whatever he was looking for. Her husband replied that he hoped it wasn't contagious and turned over the sign to closed. By the end of that year, the Faust house had gained a reputation not of danger, but of expectation, as if on certain nights the city itself leaned closer, curious to hear how the argument between man and mystery would end. There are bargains so quiet that history forgets to record them. And then there are the ones Prague remembers forever, the kind whispered to walls that know how to listen. One cold evening, the lights in the Faust house shone brighter than ever before. The square outside was empty, the air sharp and metallic. Those few who passed claimed they heard music from within, not melody, but a pulse, a rhythm of glass and flame. The doctor had been at work for days without rest. His notes, when later found, were full of circles inside circles, the word illumination written dozens of times. He had grown thin, his hands trembling, but his voice, neighbors said, had become strangely calm, as if rehearsing for a conversation he could no longer postpone. No one knows precisely what happened that night. Some said he had summoned a presence. Others believed he had finally reasoned himself into the company of something that didn't require an invitation. A servant girl, the last to leave the house before midnight, told the apothecary she had seen two shadows where only one man stood. She left the city the next morning. By dawn, the upper windows were black. No smoke rose from the chimneys. When the mayor's guards entered days later, the rooms were undisturbed, save for the study, where the air shimmered faintly, like heat above snow. The crucible was cold, the fire gone, the manuscripts half burned. On the table, a small circle of scorched wood marked where something, or someone, had simply ceased to be. Prague, ever pragmatic, accepted this development with the same tone it used for floods and politics. Unfortunate, but interesting. The house was sealed, blessed twice, and left to its own devices. In taverns, they debated what exactly had happened. The pious spoke of a pact with the devil, the scholars of a failed experiment in magnetism. The rest merely shrugged. In Prague, the distance between faith and physics has always been polite but small. For months, the square was quiet. The only movement came from pigeons who avoided the roof for reasons known only to pigeons. Then, one spring evening, a faint glow returned to the upper windows, pale, colourless, steady. No one went closer. The city had learned a valuable lesson. When a door stays closed by choice, it is best to thank it for the courtesy. And so the Faust house settled back into silence, that peculiar, heavy kind that feels less like absence and more like waiting. Time in Prague is flexible. It stretches, folds, and occasionally takes the long way back. The Faust house did not decay. It simply continued, the way a dream does after the dreamer has left. Tenants came and went. Some stayed long enough to move furniture in. Others lasted until the first night's noises. There was nothing dramatic, just the small, deliberate mischiefs that make a building feel opinionated. Keys disappeared. Doors latched themselves. Candles guttered in rooms without wind. A clerk who rented a room for a summer reported that his inkwell never stayed full. Each morning, it was half empty, as if the house were editing him. A tailor once claimed his measuring tape had changed length overnight, longer by exactly one regret. Even the most skeptical admitted that the air inside was odd. It smelled faintly of soot and old books, but beneath that lingered something metallic, like lightning rehearsing. Visitors often found themselves whispering, even in daylight, though no one could explain why. Now and then, brave landlords attempted to modernize it. They repaired plaster, replaced locks, added light fixtures, which worked until midnight, and then reconsidered. One electrician, after 3 failed attempts to wire the attic, announced that the problem isn't technical, it's theological, and never returned. Superstition, of course, is a form of respect. The locals stopped calling it cursed and began calling it complicated, which in Prague is often the same thing. From the square, the house looked ordinary enough, a bit too serious perhaps, but polite. Yet inside, the sense persisted that someone, somewhere, was still taking notes. Children dared each other to touch the door after dark. Merchants avoided storing goods near the cellar wall that sometimes hummed faintly, like a tuning fork buried under centuries. One night, a watchman passing by swore he saw light flickering in the upper room again. Not fire, but the kind of glow that means someone is thinking too hard. By morning, it was gone, and the city carried on, grateful for a mystery that asked nothing more than to be left alone. Prague has never minded its legends so long as they pay rent on time, and the Faust house, in its own strange way, never moved out. Centuries passed, and Prague acquired new machinery for disbelief. The old city of miracles grew cables and rail lines, laboratories replaced monasteries, and superstition found work in the tourism industry. Yet the Faust house remained. It leaned modestly against the corner of Charles Square, pretending to be an address like any other. The gas lights outside became electric, the horses became trams, and still, at certain hours, the house looked as though it were waiting for the Middle Ages to apologize. Scholars came with notebooks, instruments, and theories polished to a modern shine. They measured air pressure, humidity, and magnetic fields. One brought a camera, confident that glass and silver could trap what centuries of rumor could not. He left with blurred negatives and an unpleasant sense of being observed by architecture. An engineer once proposed opening the sealed cellar. "For research," he said. The council agreed. After 3 days of work, the diggers reported that the stairway went farther down than it should. When one of them dropped a lantern, it vanished without sound. The project ended quietly over lunch. Even skeptics found the house persuasive. Some said it was simply acoustics, the thick walls collecting city echoes. Others suggested it was the product of suggestion, that centuries of rumor had bent reality out of courtesy. Both explanations were correct enough to be safe. Meanwhile, the legend adapted, as legends do. The devil faded from the story, replaced by words like energy, resonance, and psychic residue. It was still Prague's favorite ghost. It had just learned new vocabulary. By the late 20th century, tourists were invited to admire the building's facade, to photograph the spot where genius had supposedly outstayed its welcome. Guides spoke of alchemists and accidents in tones suitable for polite disbelief. Inside, restoration workers noticed something peculiar. Paint refused to dry evenly on certain walls. Tools misplaced themselves. then reappeared in exactly the wrong order. And once, only once, a worker claimed he heard a soft tapping from within the plaster, like someone testing for weakness. The architect dismissed it as settling. The others didn't argue. By the time the scaffolding came down, the city had grown around the Faust house, like ivy around a tombstone. It no longer frightened anyone. It simply reminded them, politely, persistently, that even progress leaves certain questions unanswered. And on rare nights, when the streetlights flickered, passers-by could see a pale gleam behind the upper windows, steady as thought, patient as time, utterly unimpressed by modernity. Today, the Faust house still stands on its corner, looking slightly surprised to have survived everything. Cars roll past, tourists glance up from their phones, and trams hum by like clockwork pretending to be progress. The city has grown louder, but the house listens just as intently as it did 500 years ago. The facade is pale, elegant, and indifferent. Behind it lies a maze of rooms that smell of old varnish and older conversations. Some serve as offices now, others as storage. But there are still spaces where no one lingers, the rooms that insist on a little silence. Caretakers say the house behaves itself most of the time. The lights flicker politely, not theatrically. The floors creak in historical rhythm. Once in a while, a door that should open inward opens out, as if the building disagrees with geometry. Visitors come with curiosity and leave with unease they can't quite name. They speak of the odd temperature shifts, the subtle hum that seems to come from nowhere, and the way the air feels heavier in the corners, like breath held too long. There is one door, plain, wooden, unremarkable, that guides have learned not to mention. It sits beneath the staircase, behind an old cupboard. Every few years, someone tries to open it, usually a brave intern or an especially confident journalist. The key never fits, though there are many keys. And the handle, when turned, always stops halfway, as if something on the other side is considering whether to let go. They say the cellar beyond that door descends deeper than the blueprints admit. But no one checks anymore. The city has decided that some mysteries make better landmarks when left unsolved. On summer evenings, when the square outside glows with cafe lights and passing trams cast long shadows across the facade, the house seems almost content. It has kept its secret longer than most countries keep their borders. And yet, if you stand across the street at dusk, you might see a pale light still flicker in the upper room, the same one that once glowed with impossible colors. It's nothing unusual, of course. Just the house remembering a conversation it once had with a man who asked too many questions. After all, Prague is full of memories, and some of them insist on staying indoors. Prague never explains itself. It prefers implication to confession, mystery to evidence, and the occasional unsettling coincidence to any formal apology. The Faust house fits perfectly into that tradition, a polite reminder that not every door in the city opens outward. People still argue about what really happened there. Was it sorcery, science, or simply ambition carried past the point of good manners? The theologians blame pride, the physicists blame air pressure, and the locals blame the building, which is easier. But perhaps the truth is less theatrical. Perhaps the old scholar merely discovered what every seeker learns sooner or later, that knowledge, like fire, illuminates most beautifully when it's just about to burn something down. The house, having witnessed it all, endures with faint amusement. Its walls hold no malice, only memory. At night, when the square is quiet and the city's lights tremble on the river, it seems to breathe. Not haunting, just existing, as if content to let curiosity do the haunting for it. If you ever pass by after midnight, when Prague feels slightly detached from the present, pause for a moment. You might sense the air grow still, the way it does when thought turns into prayer. And if you feel the urge to knock on the door, don't. The house has heard enough questions for one lifetime. At the turn of the 17th century, Prague was a city in the mood to perform. It gleamed with towers, chimneys, and rumours, a place where theology debated astronomy in taverns, and philosophers paid rent by predicting eclipses for noblemen who didn't believe in them. From the hill above the Vltava, the castle watched the river like a mirror reflecting its own thoughts. Inside those walls lived Emperor Rudolf II, ruler of half of Europe and master of nothing at all except his own curiosity. Under his reign, Prague became a museum disguised as a capital. Ships brought objects from lands so far away that even the cartographers hesitated to name them. Crates of coral, shells, bones, lenses, fossils, tapestries, stuffed crocodiles, glass spheres, ancient coins, all carried through the castle gates by servants who long ago stopped asking why. Rudolf collected everything except simplicity. He had mathematicians who refused to agree on numbers, painters who argued with angels, and alchemists who promised to turn failure into progress. He gave them rooms, gold, and permission to break things in the name of discovery. Visitors found the castle dazzling and faintly exhausting. In one room, automata ticked softly in the dark, brass figures bowing to no one in particular. In another, telescopes pointed toward ceilings painted with stars. The air smelled of oil, ink, and mild heresy. Outside, the people of Prague learned to live with the sound of experiments. At night, the castle glowed with the orange breath of furnaces. By morning, the river carried away thin trails of smoke and untested ideas. The scholars called it a golden age. The priests called it a distraction. The servants called it Tuesday. Through it all, Rudolf wandered his palace in silence, trailing questions that had outgrown their answers. He preferred lenses to crowns, fossils to wars, and painters to generals. He was a man who ruled the world but trusted only glass. It was said that he could spend hours staring at a single gemstone, convinced that light itself was trying to tell him something. It may even have been right. For now, the city thrived. The streets filled with scholars, magicians, and men who could explain the universe for a reasonable fee. The taverns echoed with arguments about whether the earth moved around the sun or merely pretended to. And from the castle tower, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire looked down upon it all, half scientist, half dreamer, and wondered, not for the first time, whether knowledge and madness were simply two sides of the same coin he'd been polishing his entire life. Rudolf II ruled like a librarian with delusions of geography. He governed the Holy Roman Empire from his castle in Prague, though governed may be too generous a word. What he truly did was collect knowledge, objects, people, and, when pressed, nations. His ambition was simple and, therefore, impossible: to gather the world until it made sense. The castle corridors filled with curiosities, bones from extinct beasts, clocks that imitated prayer, crystals that refused to stay dull, and portraits so lifelike that courtiers bowed to them by accident. In the stables, he kept lions, eagles, and at least one creature the royal chronicler refused to describe out of respect for taxonomy. His treasure chambers resembled a negotiation between science and superstition. Next to an astrolabe sat a saint's finger. Beside a stuffed bird from the New World, a philosopher's skull painted with constellations. Everything, Rudolf believed, belonged to a single grand design, if only he could find the key to rearrange it properly. He was not the first ruler to chase immortality, but he was perhaps the first to attempt it through curation. Ministers complained that the empire was drifting. Rudolf countered that empires were temporary, but truth was permanent. His chancellor suggested they were not mutually exclusive. Rudolf disagreed, politely and decisively, by locking the council chamber and losing the key. Visitors described him as courteous, absent-minded, and vaguely illuminated, like a candle that has learned philosophy. He greeted ambassadors while absent-mindedly polishing gemstones or asking whether their country produced good alchemists. If it did, he considered that an alliance. Evenings were his favorite. He would stroll among his treasures by candlelight, touching the glass globes and brass instruments with the reverence of a priest tending relics. Sometimes he murmured to them in Latin, German, or whatever language curiosity used that day. In his private diary he wrote, "The world is a cabinet. God has filled it. I merely arranged the drawers." And yet, behind the grandeur lay unease. Each object, each miracle, each triumph of discovery only deepened the question he could not stop asking. What connects it all? No answer came, only more shipments. So the castle grew heavier with marvels. The throne room smelled faintly of varnish and melancholy. And the emperor, surrounded by everything, found himself studying the one thing he did not yet understand, his own reflection in the glass of an unfinished experiment. By the late 1500s, Prague Castle had become a crowded miracle. It was less an imperial court and more a polite confusion of scientists, dreamers, and people who could set something on fire in the name of progress. At its heart walked Emperor Rudolf II, gliding from workshop to workshop like a host, uncertain which party he had organized. Here worked Tycho Brahe, the astronomer with a golden nose and a personality to match, mapping the heavens from the castle roof, surrounded by charts, lenses, and assistants who had learned to duck during his enthusiasm. Beside him, Johannes Kepler, patient and meticulous, tried to turn Tycho Brahe's chaos into equations that would survive the shouting. Elsewhere, the alchemists clanged and whispered in their cellars, boiling metals and confidence in equal measure. Some claimed to be near the secret of transmutation. Others were near bankruptcy. One group announced they had turned lead into gold. Upon inspection, it was cheese. Rudolf congratulated them anyway. He admired conviction. The emperor's tolerance for failure was infinite, provided it was ambitious. He rewarded curiosity the way other rulers rewarded conquest. When a man presented him with a machine that could play a flute by itself, Rudolf declared it a perfect metaphor for government. At night, the castle shone like a lantern above the city. From the observatory came the ticking of gears and the turning of celestial globes. From the lower chambers, the hiss of furnaces and the unmistakable smell of experiment. The guards, unqualified in philosophy, referred to it all as noise with consequences. Rudolf wandered among his geniuses in silence, occasionally stopping to ask questions that made them uneasy, not because they were foolish, but because they were too good. "Do you think the stars notice us watching?" he once asked Kepler, who reportedly took 3 days to answer. To some, he seemed enlightened. To others, dangerously distracted. Ministers wrote reports, courtiers whispered about neglect, and ambassadors learned to wait while the emperor compared the reflective qualities of moonstone and mercury. But Prague itself, the living, breathing city, adored the spectacle. Scholars filled its taverns, philosophers argued under gas lamps, and poets took notes in case the world ended mid-sentence. It was said that on certain nights, when the castle fires burned high and the stars leaned closer than usual, the air above the city shimmered faintly, as if all those minds, straining toward heaven at once, had made the universe blush. In the highest chambers of Prague Castle, where even the guards spoke softly, Rudolf II worked alone. He called it study, though to most observers it looked like insomnia dressed in velvet. The room was lined with instruments, celestial globes, magnifying lenses, retorts, mirrors, bones, and things that glowed faintly without permission. Each table carried an unfinished thought, a melted candle beside an unfinished formula, a half-painted portrait waiting for revelation rather than varnish. Here, the emperor searched not for gold, but for pattern. He believed that if he arranged the objects of the world precisely enough, minerals beside manuscripts, feathers beside fossils, the universe might finally explain itself. He trusted arrangement the way others trusted prayer. Sometimes he experimented himself, coaxing vapors through glass or studying the way light fractured in water. The servants learned to knock before entering, partly out of respect, partly to avoid explosions. On quieter nights, he invited the stars in through his telescope. He would sit for hours, watching Jupiter crawl across the sky, muttering to himself that perhaps the heavens were not divine at all, just patient. The line between science and sorcery blurred pleasantly for him. When theologians warned against certain experiments, he smiled and said that ignorance was a far greater sin. When alchemists promised miracles, he reminded them that truth, too, required faith. He dreamed of a world reconciled, where angels and equations would finally agree on their numbers. But the more he understood, the lonelier it became. Knowledge, he realized, does not hold your hand once it answers your question. The courtiers whispered that the emperor was slipping into melancholy. He simply said he was listening more carefully. They found him one morning, asleep at his desk, a candle burned to the wick, his face lit by the pale reflection of a crystal sphere. When woken, he claimed he had been speaking with light itself, and that it had been most encouraging. Whether that conversation ever ended is uncertain. Even now, the room seems to remember him, the air faintly metallic, the light bending a little strangely, as if still trying to finish the sentence he began. Great courts are like mirrors. They reflect the mind of the monarch until no one is entirely sure who's seeing whom. By the first years of the new century, Prague Castle had begun to resemble its emperor, brilliant, restless, and just slightly unhinged. Rudolf II no longer held audiences so much as he hosted them, gatherings of scholars, mystics, painters, and diplomats who found themselves unsure whether they were attending a symposium or a séance. The line between the two had blurred pleasantly. The castle's lower halls buzzed with arguments about the music of the spheres. The upper halls whispered about politics. Ministers waited outside while alchemists carried messages in. Decisions were postponed indefinitely on the grounds of philosophy. Outside the gates, the empire creaked. Famine in one province, revolt in another. Letters piled up, unopened, because the emperor was busy reading the stars. His generals muttered that astrology had replaced strategy. Rudolf responded that both required the same precision and the same amount of luck. Still, the shadows lengthened. Visitors noticed the silence between experiments, the way torches burned lower, the way even laughter seemed to echo too long. The astronomers complained of headaches, the painters of sleeplessness. One night, a scholar swore the stars had changed positions. Kepler called it error. Rudolf called it proof. Rumors of enchantment spread through Prague. that something unseen now inhabited the castle. Not a ghost exactly, but an accumulation of human obsession. The citizens, practical as always, avoided walking too near the palace walls after dark. Within, Rudolf's own reflection began to trouble him. He said that mirrors no longer agreed about his appearance, that some nights they showed him older, others younger, sometimes someone else entirely. He ordered them all covered. Ministers begged him to return to Vienna, to restore order, to act like an emperor. Rudolf declined politely, saying that emperors were easy to replace, but Prague, Prague, was irreplaceable. And so he stayed in his golden labyrinth, half museum, half monastery, surrounded by men who could name every star, but not the hour. The city below began to whisper that perhaps the emperor had finally achieved transmutation, not of metals, but of reality itself. And maybe, in a sense, he had, turning an empire of stone and blood into a kingdom of shadows where reason flickered like candlelight and the brightest minds mistook reflection for revelation. It began quietly, as collapses often do, with letters unanswered and footsteps in the corridor that didn't echo quite right. The ministers met without him now. The generals, once ornamental, remembered their usefulness. Brothers plotted, envoys travelled, and while kingdoms shifted on paper, the emperor stayed in his rooms, studying dust motes in the sunlight, as if they might finally reveal the geometry of truth. Rudolf II had surrounded himself with wonders, and now the wonders were leaving. Tycho Brahe had died, Kepler had moved on, and the alchemists, those tireless optimists, were disappearing into debts and disguises. The castle, once a hive of brilliance, fell into the polite silence of things unobserved. Outside, Prague trembled with rumour that the emperor no longer recognized faces, that he spoke to his instruments as if they were courtiers, that his crown had been misplaced among his curiosities. None of it was entirely untrue. The treasury was exhausted, the empire fragmented, and ambassadors arrived to find the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire asking whether they believed metals could dream. The Jesuits prayed for him. The scientists took notes. His brother Matthias gathered allies and armies under the pretext of stability. Rudolf called it an experiment in treachery. When the troops finally surrounded the castle, no battle followed. Only the sigh of resignation, peculiar to scholars who realize that history has changed the topic without warning. The emperor yielded Prague and kept his collections. He wandered through them as through an afterlife of his own making. Corridors lined with clocks that no longer ticked, cages without occupants, paintings whose eyes followed no one anymore. They say he spoke less in those last years. When he did, it was usually to the objects, to a telescope, a skull, a crystal, a stuffed bird. "You understand," he would murmur, and perhaps they did. One winter evening, a servant found him asleep beside his desk, the candle burned to wax and the ink dry mid-sentence. He had been writing a list, a final catalogue. At the bottom, in his slanted hand, only one entry remained. Light. He died surrounded by everything he loved, and by nothing that could save him. Outside, the snow fell over Prague, covering statues, roofs, and ambitions alike, making even failure look briefly immaculate. After Rudolf's death, the castle exhaled, a long, weary sound like parchment settling. Servants moved cautiously, as if the walls themselves were still deciding whether the emperor was truly gone. Then came the collectors of a different kind. Courtiers, relatives, envoys, all with ledgers in hand, descended upon his palace to inventory the impossible. What they found defied even bureaucracy's appetite for order. There were rooms of mirrors that faced each other into infinity, cabinets of stones that glowed faintly in the dark, cages filled with skeletons of creatures that refused clear classification, paintings of saints beside sketches of comets, charts without labels, notes without endings. In one chamber, a telescope stood aimed not at the window, but at a wall. No one moved it. In another, a globe rotated slowly by itself until the clerk taking notes fainted politely. Historians would later call it the first modern museum, though it felt more like the attic of creation, a collection of unfinished thoughts. Kepler returned briefly, walking through the corridors like a man in a dream. He found his old astronomical instruments beside a jar labelled Sol, 1602. He chose not to open it. The new emperor ordered the archives sorted, the curiosities sold or sent to Vienna. But Prague, stubborn as ever, kept a few pieces for itself. The astronomer's tower remained, the cellars stayed locked, and the locals swore that on cold nights faint lights still shimmered behind the high windows, soft, pulsing, and patient. The scholars said it was phosphorus. The priests said penance. The city said Rudolf had left something switched on. Over time, the dust grew thick, and the world moved on to cleaner kinds of magic: electricity, industry, progress. But deep within the castle, behind a door that no one seemed to notice, lay a small room with a single lens resting on a wooden table. Sometimes, just before dawn, it caught the first light of morning and scattered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows on the stone wall. A quiet gesture from an emperor who once tried to catalogue the universe and almost succeeded. History remembers Rudolf II as many things: a patron of genius, a collector of wonders, a dreamer who misplaced his empire somewhere between art and astronomy. But Prague remembers him differently. Here, he is the man who taught the city to love its own strangeness. In the end, Rudolf's experiments proved something even his alchemists could not: that the line between faith and curiosity is not a line at all, but a circle. You can walk it forever. And he did. The treasures he gathered have long been scattered, but their ghosts remain. A lens that still bends light oddly, a painting that glows faintly under the right moon, a telescope that refuses to stay pointed at the same star. Each one a polite reminder that knowledge never truly stays in its cabinet. Prague, of course, approved. It has always preferred its geniuses a little haunted and its emperors a little mad. The city thrives on that delicate mixture of brilliance and doubt. The chemistry Rudolf perfected without meaning to. Walk the castle courtyard at dusk, and you can still feel it, the air charged, as if expecting an experiment to resume at any moment. Some say that on clear nights, a window in the northern tower glows faintly, not from candlelight, but from a question that refuses to go out. Perhaps that was Rudolf's true discovery. That wonder, once lit, doesn't die with its maker. It lingers quietly, stubbornly, in the stones of the city that hums beneath it, still testing the equation between human curiosity and the stars.